we are going to shift gears a little bit. And we're going to talk about a policy that has affected so many people, so many communities. It's stop and frisk. And we're going to ask the question, how can community transform policy? So to do that, Renita, Francois of MAP, who we've heard from, and Jinhee Lee of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund are going to have a conversation. And so I welcome them and turn this over to them. Any questions that you may have, please put in the chat. And so Renita and Jinhee, I pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Raz. And thank you, Jen, for joining us from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Hope I said that right. We wanted, I'm going to give Jen a chance to introduce herself, but I want to do some framing for this because many of you all have been to NeighborhoodStat over the years. If you can believe it, this is going to be our 5th year doing NeighborhoodStat. We've come a long way, and many of you have seen us through a variety of iterations of this. But our goal for this year, as we come to the end of the de Blasio administration, not the end of MAP, but at the end of this administration, we really want to take our goals up to the next level. And so a part of that, we've talked a long time about residents coming to the table to create policy with agency leaders and policymakers. And so in order for us to really do that, we want to, one, make sure you're prepared and you have the tools to do it. And two, we want to create access to opportunities to do that. So I like to call a thing a thing. We all know that stop and frisk was a controversial point in our history here. It was an unjust policy that disproportionately affected Black and Brown New Yorkers. And so for some people, perhaps it's a touchy subject to get into, but it is our history and we have to come to terms with our history in order to change it. So the point of this exercise and conversation we're going to do today is to really unpack what happened to change that policy. And we're doing that because in order for us to have you come to the table to create policy, we want you to be able to see it. We want you to be able to unpack a process that was changed and sort of go through the motions with someone who was a part of that to understand what the different dynamics and components of that were. So we all know it happened. Many of us, I think, know the outcome of that, but we wanted to just go through a few of the steps in the process that it took to change that so that we can replicate it in other areas across the 5 different things that we've identified so that we can change it. So I'm going to let Jen introduce herself, and then she and I are going to get into a conversation about how you do that. Jen.
Well, thank you, Renita, and thank you so much for everyone who organized this incredible event, for inviting me to speak. I have been so incredibly inspired from just the video. It was so inspiring, and just the whole concept of this summit, I think, is just wonderful and very much in line with what we're trying to achieve at the Legal Defense Fund, which is, empowering people of color to be able to advocate for themselves and really kind of to have the lives that they're entitled to. And so it's just a real honor for me to be a part of this. And as Renita said, I am a lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I can't believe it's been this long, but 11 years ago, we filed a lawsuit challenging how the NYPD had been policing NYCHA residences, specifically focusing on trespass enforcement. Back when we filed our lawsuit, it was a really incredibly, it was just a horrific problem. I think some of you probably remember this. For just as an example, Black people in New York City were 19 times more likely to be stopped for trespass, 10 times more likely to be arrested for trespass. And we saw this really happening within NYCHA residences. Renita had mentioned the issue of stop and frisk, which was something that affected the entire city, but it had even a greater effect within NYCHA residences. And so that was something that we had challenged. It's been ongoing during that entire time. I've been a part of the case during that time. And And right now, we're part of a monitoring effort working with other, the lawyers in other cases, a court-appointed monitor, as well as the NYPD, working together to try to ensure permanent changes within the police department to ensure that those kinds of practices and policies just don't happen again. I'm not saying that we have by all means not solved all the problems, and that's something that we're continuing to do. But one of the reasons I was just so happy to be invited to this is that I just firmly believe, from my experiences over the past decade, that in order for us to have real solutions, it's just absolutely essential for NYCHA residents to be a part of the solution, because the residents are the ones that have the expertise on these issues. You're the one that are facing these problems. You're the ones that know what the solutions would be, to make your lives better and to ensure security of your homes, but also the respect and dignity that you deserve. So again, thank you so much, Renita. I'm so glad to be a part of this conversation with you.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for that overview. You kind of touched on the first thing that I was going to get into, which was to really frame out, because one of the things that we work with residents to do is to identify their priorities. And the way that they do that is by looking at data, looking at their personal experience, and trying to frame out the issue that they want to tackle. So can you frame out the issue that was at hand in this matter and how it came to the forefront? So how was this uncovered? What were the contributing factors to the policy being implemented? Who was impacted? And what information led to the identification of this issue? So if you can just give us some kind of.
Well, I think there was a lot of information at the time that kind of really showed how much of a problem this was within NYCHA developments. First, just talking about data, and I think this is just really important, that data be publicly available and easily available, so that everyone could be able to access that information. At the time, I just mentioned some of the statistics, but it was just an overwhelming number of people who were being arrested and stopped for trespass. Overwhelmingly, people of color, Black and Latinx people. It was a severe problem with the NYCHA developments, more than other parts of the city, primarily because police officers are permitted to conduct vertical patrols within NYCHA homes. This is not something that happens in other apartment buildings in the city unless there's some sort of special program that a landlord kind of agrees with the police department. But I think most of the residents know that police officers are allowed to go into the buildings. And what we saw at the time was just a lot of innocent people, kind of in residents and their guests, just being harassed. So we had public defenders seeing all of these trespass arrests, which were not even prosecuted because once they got to the station, they realized the person arrested was actually a resident of the building that they were arrested in, for trespassing. And we saw that with some of our clients too, and I'm sure that many of you have heard similar stories or had similar experiences of being stopped or possibly arrested for, waiting in the lobby for a pizza delivery, or being stopped because you went downstairs to get your mail in your pajamas or taking out the trash. And we had stories of people getting arrested because they went to go visit their grandmother and the grandmother wasn't home, and then got arrested for trespassing. So these were some of the horrific stories that we were seeing, and just seeing that this is just a waste of resources. Police officers and are supposed to be using their time and their energy, kind of enforcing the law and keeping people safe. But if they're spending their time stopping and arresting innocent people and having them go through the process of getting their charges dismissed and things like that, that's a waste for everyone, and obviously a tremendous harm to the residents themselves and the guests who are kind of experiencing all of these things. And then we were hearing from also community groups. So Good Old Lower East Side, Community Voices Heard, people who had real contacts with the community, kind of being very outspoken about these ongoing abusive practices that were happening. And so obviously this is something that drew our attention, and one of the reasons why we decided to take some legal action to try to remedy it.
Now, it's because I think it's important for us to understand how something that may have been let's say, well-intentioned. Is, you know, we've been at a number of meetings where, you know, residents don't all think the same things. There are some people who are like, I don't want to see people hanging out when I come home. There are some people who feel like it doesn't bother me that the people who live here hang out where they live. And so because of those different perspectives, you know, I can say on the policymaking side, you're presented with so many different opinions about an issue. And so, you know, sometimes the thought and the care that needs to go into thinking about how the decisions we make may affect different groups of people, sometimes that's missed. So can you talk a little bit about what the policy was meant to achieve and how, you know, agencies, you know, like NYCHA, like NYPD, or any other agency that is creating policy in the future, what process should they go through to hear from people in the community about methods to address the issues that they bring up? How should they approach getting community input? Talked a little bit about this in our pre-conversation. So,
no, I think that is a really great question, and I feel like, just from my experience with this case, one thing that I've learned is, well, one, I just want to make this clear. I've really learned to appreciate and love and respect the people who live in NYCHA. You know, that there's just wonderful families, intergenerational families, people who are really active in their community. And the other thing that I realized is that it's not a monolith. You know, people are different. People have different experiences, the different types of buildings. You know, it's not as if there's I mean, absolutely, there's no cookie cutter NYCHA residents or NYCHA development. There's so much diversity, different boroughs and so forth. And there's intergenerational difference too. You know, the experiences of someone who's older may be very different from young people, and we see that across the board when it comes to policing. So, so one thing that I absolutely learned to appreciate is that there is a diversity of experiences and perspectives, and something that I think is really important. The one commonality, though, is that, and something that I also learned, is that every single NYCHA resident demands to be treated with respect, and that you know, just because you live in public housing doesn't mean that your rights are any different than people who don't live in public housing. And you know, constitutional rights are the same regardless of who you are or where you live or what your race is. And so, and that's something that I think is something that we try to emphasize in our case. Now, to your question about, you know, policy and how important it is to get community perspectives, you know, that was something that we also really learned to appreciate in our case as well. And I'll just use one kind of example. You know, many of you know those signs that are in NYCHA developments all across the city, you know, kind of saying no littering, no lingering, you know, just kind of like, these are the NYCHA rules. And that sign did not come out of nowhere. You know, that was those rules, you know, these NYCHA rules, and they're in the, I think in the release, when you sign the release and so forth, they were actually created from a task force that was comprised of NYPD officials, NYCHA officials, and some members of NYCHA, you know, like some NYCHA residents, but it was really limited to just the members of the Citywide Council of Presidents. And, you know, I think the intent was to create rules that everyone would know about and would try to promote safety and security in NYCHA developments. But what happened is a very negative consequence, and I'll just use one as an example, is the rule against lingering, which, you know, I think that the idea is that they didn't want people to just be hanging out in lobbies and so forth and things like that. But because of that, and because police officers are empowered to enforce these rules, you had police officers enforcing a non-criminal rule against lingering. So it's not a crime to linger. There's nothing in the penal code that says lingering is a crime. But because you know housing officers enforce not only criminal laws but also NYCHA rules, you know, they're told that they have to enforce rules against lingering. And then the question is, what is lingering? Is lingering, you know, kind of talking to your neighbor as you're at the mailboxes? Is it, you know, waiting for a pizza? Is it, you know, kind of, it's a rainy day? This actually happened to one of our clients. You know, it was late at night and she was waiting for a friend to come and pick her up and walk together. home because she didn't want to walk by herself. She was ultimately arrested because, she was in, kind of in the lobby waiting for a friend to kind of walk home with her because she had been visiting some family. So, so that's, so those are some of the reasons why it is so important when you create policy, like the rules that kind of govern everyone who lives in public housing as well as their guests, to really think through all the consequences and to get a diverse perspective. So young people, like, what does it mean for them to be lingering? Would they want that role? It's just, I think these are really important questions to have, and to make sure that you have kind of a representative perspective on what these rules mean and how it might impact everyone within the NYCHA community.
Thank you. So I want to pause there because I want to make sure that the gems that you're giving us are not missed. So I just want to call out a few things that I think are important. And if folks want to get in the chat and call out things that they feel are important to memorialize, please do that. So one, we need to, when we're making policy, we can't only think about the intended outcome we want. We need to think about the impact that it will have, intended and not intended. And it's really important to think about what the unintended effects of our decision making might be. So that is very important for all of our policy and rule making and process folks. It's always important to think about the unintended consequences, because often that's where we see disparities come out. Just understanding the history of the United States, these things happen over and over again, and it's seemingly a problem we haven't been able to solve. So that's one. And then two, it's just when we're making rules and policies and processes and procedures, it's very important to define the problem that we're trying to address. So to your point about lingering, there's so many ways that we can interpret lingering, and are lingering and loitering the same? Who knows? So it's very important as we think about the problems that we're trying to solve, that we make sure that we have the vocabulary, and that it's a shared vocabulary on what the issue is, how we're defining it, and all of that. And the best way to do that is to meet with folks of diverse backgrounds to talk about, like, we're thinking about creating this rule or this process. How do you interpret that? Tell us how you think that you might experience this policy or this process. Do you have ideas that you think might be better than what we're proposing? I don't think that we do that very often. And even though clearly I am a representative of the government, we can be honest here amongst our MAP family and say that, a lot of policy is made in office buildings by people who don't frequent the communities that the policies impact. And so that's what we're trying to change. That's why we want our residents to be aware of basically this arc of policy making and policy change, and where the opportunities are for us to jump into that process and make our voices heard. So to that point, I want to talk about the role of residents, community organizations in this process. What did people do to support change? I know a lot of it was legal, but I know that there were also advocates on the ground who took part in this process. So let's just talk a little bit about what the role of community members and residents was in this instance, and then what you think the role of residents and community organizations can be in changing other issues that they might feel are unjust or don't make sense for their communities.
Yeah. Well, even though, what I'm talking about is a lawsuit, and there are many ways that I think, many ways of affecting change. It's not just litigation, obviously, and just, it's been over 10 years. The litigation is not a very fast or, quick way of getting change. It's, the role of residents and community organizations was essential, I think, throughout the process. First of all, our plaintiffs, who are really kind of brave to put their stories out there and to get the attention and to kind of go through the legal process, despite the trauma of what they went through. For example, one of our clients, the one that he got arrested in his own home, his own building that he had lived in since he was 3 years old. So the embarrassment even of walking out of his building in front of his neighbors in handcuffs, for trespassing in a building that he had lived in since he was 3. Those things. And so going through that trauma, going through the legal process of getting a defense attorney, public defender, and all that. And then on top of that, deciding that, I want to do something about this, and I want to file a lawsuit to make change, not just for himself, but for everyone else, his neighbors and everyone else in public housing. So first and foremost are the NYCHA residents who were plaintiffs in our lawsuit. But we were always, in touch with, like I said, Goals and CVH and other organizations that gave us valuable information. I think that one of the things that, and I also want to say that this participation, these perspectives really matter, because that's what the court cares about. When the court kind of during the process, many of you know about, courts kind of issuing opinions. There's some sort of dispute, and then they issue an opinion, and most of the major opinions that the judge made in our case, in the very first 2 pages, she would quote the words of public housing residents and what they said about the problem and what they think the solutions are. So I just want to really uplift the importance of not only the participation of NYCHA residents, but also that your voices are the ones that, for example, judges care about too. The other thing that was really, I thought, a great one of the most important parts of our case is, once we settled and became a part of this monitoring process, so there was the judge appointed a court monitor. She also appointed a facilitator to kind of conduct what was called a joint remedial process. And that was meant to be a process to really get stakeholder involvement and community involvement. And what we thought was really important and made a priority is that in this kind of joint remedial process, that there had to be a specific voice on behalf of public housing residents. Because stop and frisk was a problem across the city, like I said, but for public housing residents, it's very, very unique. It's a very unique community. It's also a very large and important community. So we wanted to make sure that perspective, in particular, was addressed. So there were town halls and focus groups and meetings with, kind of the facilitator and all of that. But we also had a public housing focused town hall and public housing focused, focus groups where people were talking about the kind of their concerns about policing in their homes. So those were, an essential part of our process. And I think that it continues to be essential. And that's why, as this case continues and as we try to make real change within the police department, it is so important for public housing residents, especially if it's something that you feel passionate about, I would just welcome your involvement in this, because again, you all are the experts and you all are the ones that, we really need to be talking to in order to get real solutions that have, that in practical terms, in real terms, create changes for people's experiences. So, absolutely, it's such an important part of the legal process. I know that, sometimes litigation can seem very lawyer focused, and I'm just here to say that that's not the way it should be. It should be very much focused on the community that the litigation is supposed to be helping.
Right, so we are at our warning. I'm hearing a little echo. We're at our 5-minute warning, but I do want to just highlight that, we say all the time that resident voice should be centered in policymaking. We map folks, we talk about this. The residents have heard us say it, but I think it's important for them to hear from someone like yourself who is external to this process, just how important resident voice is and should be in the decisions that we make. So thank you for sharing that with us. If anyone has questions that they would like to put in the chat, we can try to get to a few of them. This has been, it was short, but I feel like it was very informative to have you here. It's important for us to use real life examples because we don't want to just talk about what could possibly be done. Imagine if this happened. No, this actually happened. And many people thought it was unfair, but ultimately somebody had to do something. And that applies across the board. And I hope for our policy making and enforcing friends on the line that you hear the importance of, it shouldn't get to this point where it's an adversarial situation to change policy. The relationship has to be there so that we can be in constant conversation and communication and just continuously improving our processes and policies to make the city better and more fair and more equitable for everybody. And so the way that you do that is by having community members at the table when those decisions are being made and establishing regular feedback loops for them to be able to tell you when your policy isn't working the way you intended. Someone asked, does your agency work with the CCRB?
We don't work with the CCRB. You know, we're a legal organization, so we engage in advocacy and litigation on behalf of, you know, individuals, so, you know, residents and things like that, although we certainly have interacted with the CCRB. But, you know, Renita, before I go, I just wanted, this is something that you touched upon, and I think it's just so important to kind of, in this conversation, because, you know, you had said something about kind of thinking about how to actually solve the problems. And, you know, I think that when we talk about, you know, public safety and security, one of the things that I've learned from this is that, you know, more police is not necessarily the answer. And so one of the things that I'm disappointed about our case is that we had originally sued NYCHA as well, because we thought that NYCHA was also a part of the solution in terms of trying to create better safety and security and holding, you know, police officers accountable. Because, you know, actually there's an agreement where, you know, for a long time, NYCHA paid the NYPD to provide these extra services to public housing residents. So I just really, you know, want to think, you know, I think this is something that I know others have been thinking about as well, about, you know, are there other ways of solving the solutions without having necessarily more policing, like, for example, better security, you know, locks, and locks are, you know, chronically broken, having private people, like, you know, hiring people to kind of to do things as opposed to having police officers, you know, keeping trespassers out, things like that. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as well. And also just the idea that, you know, police officers, just like any other city service, you know, any other city service that is provided is, you know, serving the community. So, you know, so we're supposed to be working for all of you, and to really, and that's something that we've always tried to emphasize in our case as well.
Definitely. We're at our time, but I think that is a key point. Public service is service. All of us government employees are public servants. So, you know, that service-minded, that should be at the forefront of everything that we're doing. Thank you, guys. You can hear more about the non-law enforcement strategies in one of our workshop sessions that will be available to you. And I will say, you know, the beauty of MAP is that we have the opportunity with NYCHA and with NYPD to think about how we can minimize enforcement and lift up the community voice and the community role in creating safe communities. So thank you so much, Jen. Folks are asking about your contact information. If we're able to put that in the chat, you let us know what you,
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
you want to do.
Thank you so much for having me. And I just think this is a wonderful event. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Back to you, Raz.
Okay. Thank you both so much. I feel like we probably could have had like an all-day summit just on this. So thank you, Renita and Jen, for bringing so much truth and knowledge to this discussion. Okay, deep breath. We are now moving into our morning panels, dialogue, and discussion. So just listen carefully and to the instructions, and I'll go over these a few times. There will be a slide appearing on the screen where you will see 3 options for panels. These are conversations for you to choose from. You choose one that you would like to attend because they are happening at the same time. 1, physical space as an innovative design opportunity. 2, health and well-being. 3, non-law enforcement strategies in communities. Again, 1, physical space as an innovative design opportunity. 2, health and well-being. 3, non-law enforcement strategies in communities. Now listen up, here's how you are going to choose. So you will need to choose between these 3. So decide right now where you want to go, which one of those you want to go to.